Hello, you are watching Talks About Future, and I'm Mark Grigorian. My guest today is Tom de Waal, Senior Fellow of Carnegie Europe. Tom de Waal is a specialist in the region of the Caucasus, author of the well-known book Black Garden about the Karabakh conflict, and also author of another book which is called The Caucasus, an introduction. And there is a third book covering the topic of the Armenian genocide and called The Great Catastrophe. So, Tom, Armenia lost the war and is going through a deep political crisis. So, what now? What comes next?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Mark. It's very nice to see you. I know that we've known each other for 20 years. It's a shame not to be with you in person, but I'm very glad to be talking to you remotely. Я тоже хочу извиниться перед русскоязычной аудиторией, что я выбрал английский язык, но это родной мой язык. Я думаю, что я буду выражать себя лучше по-английски, чем по-русски. And so we will talk in English. So the question about what happens now, and I'm very glad that you're doing this series looking at the future. Well, I think that there's a well-known English expression that victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. So I think you know, when the Armenian side was victorious in the Karabakh War of the 1990s, in 1994, that brought the nation together, Armenians together. They had solidarity in victory, in having, as they saw it, having saved Karabakh and so on. And now, of course, there's a defeat, and we're seeing recriminations, we're seeing divisions. And I think a lot of those divisions are not just about the war, they're about other issues, they're about Armenian identity, they're about the Velvet Revolution, they're about the future of Armenia. And I think obviously those conversations are inevitable. The strange thing is that I see the phenomenon now that when I first started going to Azerbaijan, well, I first started going to both Armenia, Karabakh and Azerbaijan in the 90s. And the similar phenomenon in Azerbaijan, lots of divisions in the 90s as a result of the war. I think that's inevitable. I don't think we can advise Armenians not to talk about what went wrong. But I hope there will also be a forward-looking agenda, and maybe looking at some of the advantages. I think those are not short-term advantages. I think there are many short-term problems. The short-term problems are, of course, the humanitarian costs of the conflict, those who fled Hadrut and Shushi and other places, what's going to happen to them, problems that you're seeing in Sunik now with the border and the roads, all those problems and obviously worries about the future of the Karabakh Armenians. All those worries, of course, are legitimate. But I think there's also some opportunities now, now that the territories have been around Karabakh have been deoccupied, whatever you want to say, returned to Azerbaijan. There are some opportunities there, potentially perhaps some opportunities for normalization of relations with Turkey, though important to say, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, particularly while President Erdogan is in power. But I think opportunities to focus on the Republic of Armenia and what kind of future it has. And I think that's the topic of our conversation. I'm not going to say everything at once, but clearly, you know, there are many things that a small country in that location with the talents that Armenians have can do to develop further.
We will come to the issue of Karabakh proper a bit later. But now let me ask you this question. Can we say that we here in Armenia are also going through an identity crisis? And what crisis is that? How would you describe it?
Well, absolutely. It's an identity crisis about who we are, what constitutes Armenian land, what Armenian land, is part of our national security and what isn't. And of course, you'll get different answers on that. I'm reminded that, of course, Armenians have had an identity crisis for a long time. I mean, in researching my book about Armenian Turkish issues, the aftermath of the genocide, I was struck, and I think many Armenians and others certainly forget this, that the whole of the 20th century, there was big divisions in Armenia between the Dashnak side, which very much and had one agenda, and the other political parties which had another agenda. There was divisions about whether to support Soviet Armenia. There was also, I think, two strong currents in Armenian thinking. One of which is more of a Western one, the focus on the lost lands, Western Armenia, Eastern Anatolia, everything that's lost. And then another agenda which is about the Republic of Armenia. It's about nation building. It's about making the best of the Republic of Armenia, making it a strong, thriving state. And often, I think the diaspora, many diaspora organizations, for example, have focused more of their energy on the lost lands than on the Republic of Armenia, which for them was never the proper Armenia. But it is the only Armenia really which is a state. So I think, personally, I hope that more energy can be invested in developing, constructing the Republic of Armenia, that agenda, making it a flourishing state.
And for me, it's also one of the parts of the debates, the discussion about the future. I mean, if we are focusing more on Armenia, it means that we are also shaping our national identity. Isn't it so?
Absolutely, and I think obviously Armenians are a small nation, but they have multiple identities, and that's normal. And everyone has different ancestries, and many Armenians obviously have allegiances, double allegiances, both to Armenia and to other countries. That's quite normal. But I think one thing you can say that Armenians have in common is Hayastan. It's the Republic of Armenia, and wishing it well, wishing it to succeed. I guess, and sometimes you hear these debates amongst Armenians, and kind of you don't hear that, but it's kind of, to an outsider, maybe it's more obvious.
Now, coming back to the Karabakh issue, Karabakh problem, Ilham Aliyev claimed that he has solved it, but did he?
Well, I think, I study conflicts, many conflicts around the world, and in many contexts, many of these conflicts, one side likes to say the conflict has been solved because the way of an outcome. I think many Armenians said that the conflict was solved, the Karabakh conflict was solved in the 1990s. I think so long as there are Armenians of Karabakh who think differently, then this will always be a disputed region, like many regions in the world. I mean, I can see many other contexts. Kashmir, the Indians say it's solved, the Pakistanis say it's not, Cyprus, etc. So I think as long as there is a dispute, there will be a conflict. Obviously, the symmetry of the conflict has changed. Azerbaijan is in a much stronger position than it was, 6 months ago. We all know that, but the conflict is not solved until this dispute, which goes back, as we both know, as everyone knows, more than a century, is resolved about the status of Karabakh. And let's just remind ourselves how many people did not solve this conflict. It was 1918, the British. It was 1920, the Paris Peace Conference. The Bolsheviks thought they'd solved this in 1921. Then it came back a few times in the Soviet era, and obviously the last 30 years has been dominated by this. So, I think Armenians have a much weaker position now, for sure. But I also don't think it's correct to say that the conflict is solved now.
And that also brings us to the Armenian internal politics, because around all political, the political turmoil that is happening now. Uh, I haven't heard, I mean, the political parties are kind of in a competition who will be more hostile towards Azerbaijan and who will say for more time that we are going to bring Karabakh back. We are going to restore it, and we need a powerful army, and we need, a powerful state and whatever. So the situation now, looking from the pessimistic angle, is that it's going to be a war and then another war and then probably another war. And it's very difficult to see where is the end.
Well, I mean, obviously Armenia needs an army. Armenia needs a national security strategy. And there are concerns over Sunik, and obviously there are concerns about what happens in Karabakh, where now the protector is not Yerevan, but it is Moscow now. That all of these, obviously Armenia needs a national security strategy. But I would say, from my perspective, what both Armenia and Azerbaijan need is a full peace agreement, a political agreement. Now, what we had on November the 9th, 10th was a ceasefire agreement. It was halting the fighting. It was one page with 9 points signed in the middle of night. It's not a peace agreement. What both Armenia and Azerbaijan and their neighbors, also Georgia, Turkey, Iran, Russia, need is a peace agreement, where a normalization of relations, where the two countries have economic relations, they have embassies, etc. Now, of course, we're still a million miles from that, but the aspiration has to be there, and that involves, some compromises on both sides, obviously, and it needs the language needs to change, which is difficult. If one side doesn't change the language, then both sides are not going to change it. We're seeing this fighting talk in Armenia. We're still seeing some quite aggressive language from Azerbaijan. President Aliyev's last speech, where he said Nagorno-Karabakh doesn't exist, he continues to say that the Armenians only arrived there in the 19th century. Well, none of that helps, obviously, to put it mildly. But the other thing I would say is it's not just about political parties. It's also about the public. It's about the populations. We've seen in other conflict zones, Northern Ireland, for example, also, where it's been quite successful. Cyprus, where they've made some progress but not full progress. That often parts of society are more ahead of the politicians. In Northern Ireland, the middle classes wanted peace. They were fed up with conflict. In Cyprus, large parts of the population are in favor of peace. I'd say not 50%, but 30 to 40% of the population in Cyprus wants a deal with the other side. And the business community there is very much behind normalization of relations, making a deal. It's the politicians who are behind there. So I would hope that one positive thing from this agreement is the opening of some transport economic connections. Obviously, this is difficult without some political agreement, but I would hope that business people can begin to take some advantage from this, begin to trade. As we know, Armenians and Azerbaijanis have always traded with one another, and last 30 years, as we know, they've traded with one another in Georgia. I went to the Sadakh law market, and I saw crowds and crowds of people, not a single Georgian there, Armenians and Azerbaijanis. If you apparently go to the Rustavi car market, again, you see Armenians and Azerbaijanis trading. I think Armenians and Azerbaijanis actually, I think, trade with one another more freely and naturally than they do with the Georgians. So I think that's one thing which can be promoted. I'm not saying it's the answer to everything, but it's one group I think will have more connections and can make some progress. And we can think of other groups, academic students, people who can now have more opportunity to meet and talk. Some musicians is another obvious one. I mean, again, a very small group, but I think a lot of young people I've been in contact with, who I think are fed up with this dehumanizing rhetoric about the other side. They know that the stereotypes are not true. So I would hope that there would be some people who would begin to get a bit ahead of the politicians and look for contacts with the other side. I'm not being idealistic. I know how difficult this is, but I would hope there would be some opportunities now.
We both know how difficult it is, and we both know how difficult it will be after the war, especially in these first months and first years after the war, when we still see quite a hostile attitude.
Well, and so many people died, obviously. I mean, it's just a small region, particularly in Karabakh. Every family, I mean, everyone I know in Karabakh, who I've been talking to, Karabakh Armenian friends, they all know many people who died. Obviously, I'm not going to minimize how painful it is, obviously.
It's, yes, you are right. And I just want to add something to that, because when you are in Stepanakert, you see the hills surrounding you, and you feel that at any moment there can be threat coming down from the hills. And we know that nowadays it's not like the war in 91, 94, where the threat is just there, up there in the air. And when you are in Stepanakert, you feel that there are the Russian peacekeepers who are standing behind your back and who are helping you to feel just, a bit more securely than it would be without them. And many people in Stepanakert and many people in Karabakh now would like to see their future with Russia, because Russia is actually the guarantor of their security. And but there is also a feeling when I'm back in Yerevan, when I'm in Stepanakert, I feel differently. But when I'm back in Yerevan, I also feel that it's temporary. It could be temporary. And what happens in 5 years' time?
Well, I think that's the big question here. This is not Abkhazia or South Ossetia, where the Russians are there indefinitely, will they ever leave those places? And maybe there's no reason for them to leave. This is different. As we know, the Russians have interests on both sides of this conflict. It's always been one of the complicating factors that the Russians are there in Karabakh to protect the Karabakh Armenians. That's their job. And undoubtedly the Karabakh Armenians, I haven't been there since the conflict, but undoubtedly the Karabakh Armenians feel some loyalty to Russia as a result of that, and maybe they always did. But on the other hand, this mission is there with the consent of Azerbaijan, and in 5 years' time, or 4.5 years' time, Azerbaijan has the right of veto over the extension of the 5-year mission. So the Russians are looking both ways here, and that's, I think, a very difficult thing for the Russians to manage. They can't just act like they did in Abkhazia, South Ossetia. They can't take over the place. They're there with the express agreement of Baku. So I do think that's a difficult situation, and I do have fears as well, worries that this whole thing could break down in 5 years' time.
And it can break down even earlier, taking into consideration Russia's relations with Turkey. Because,
yeah, well, I mean, I think Russian relations with Turkey are an interesting one. I think these two, well, while we've still got these two regimes in Russia and Turkey, which we have, I think, for a while, the Putin regime and the Erdogan regime, I think they compete, but they also understand each other quite well. That when they're talking on the phone, I think Putin and Erdogan are having some pretty tough negotiations, but they also kind of understand and respect one another, and they also like the fact that each one can deliver, and they also have a shared agenda, which reminds me of Lenin and Mustafa Kemal back in a century ago, negotiating over the Treaty of Kars. Again, difficult negotiations, but they had a shared agenda, which was to keep the West out of the region.
A question came in from aravot.am website,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll try to translate it now. What is your opinion when, before the war, the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, said Artsakh is Armenia, and period.
Mm-hmm.
And then another quote, I am starting the negotiations from my own starting point. What he said, how was that perceived from the side of Azerbaijan? And how did it trigger something from the Azeri side?
Well, I mean, what one would have to give a very long answer to that question. I think clearly the answer is yes. It did. It was seen as very provocative in Azerbaijan to make that statement. I guess the thing to say here is that there's always been only one real framework solution for this conflict. Well, obviously, full military victory, which I don't think either side could ever achieve. Armenia didn't achieve it in 1994, and I don't think Azerbaijan achieved it in 2020, full defeat of the other side. But if not that, then I think the solution was always going to be that Azerbaijan gets the 7 territories around Karabakh back, minus the Lachin corridor or some corridor to Armenia, and there's some kind of self-rule for the Armenians of Karabakh. That was always going to be the solution. We have some kind of version of that solution, but obviously not so good for the Armenians, even worse for the Armenians in the sense they lost a lot of Karabakh itself. So I think on the Azerbaijani side, when they saw some of the statements that Nikol Pashinyan was making, for whatever reason he made them, maybe he wasn't in fact so serious about them, but he made them and they were heard, then Azerbaijan said, well, he's not negotiating anymore, so there's nothing to negotiate, there's nothing to talk about, so maybe we go back to war at this point. So I think that those statements, I think, empowered the hawks in Azerbaijan, those who said there's no point in negotiating. I think that's definitely true to say. I would also say that I also, as you know, have many criticism for Azerbaijan's inflexibility over the years, the fact that the Azerbaijanis never offered to talk to the Armenians of Karabakh in 30 years, that there was never, they talked about autonomy, but there was never any document searching up, that there was nothing really, the Azerbaijanis were not really offering anything serious from their side either. So when they said that negotiations weren't working, they didn't look at themselves and think why they weren't working from their side as well, obviously.
Now, there is another, I mean, it's a huge humanitarian crisis now in Karabakh. And I think that this crisis has, I mean, for the Armenians, it's unbelievably bad. I've been there several times after the war, and I've seen that with my own eyes. But this humanitarian crisis has also another dimension. There are many Azeris who were saying for decades that they are, they cannot wait to come back to their former homes. What do you think? Will they come back eventually?
Well, I think that depends on the individuals and the possibilities. Obviously, there are Azeris who lived in places like Khojaly or Stepanaket, who we're not expecting them to go home anytime soon. There are Azeris from Shusha, or Shushi, as Armenians call it, Shusha as the Azerbaijanis call it, who I think can expect to go home. Although I think there are questions about what extent Shusha is a viable place without links to Stepanakert. I think the two towns are kind of interconnected, and there are also obviously Azeris who will be going home to places like Agdan, Fizuli, and so on. I think much more difficult to go places like Kelbajar. I mean, I think and also there are younger people who maybe will want to go and visit, but they'll think, what kind of life can I build for myself in the middle of Kelbajar when I grew up in Baku? So lots and lots of questions here. I think what we can safely say is that a lot of these places are really interconnected economically, that they will not be economically viable. That Karabakh, Kelbajar, Lachin, Shusha, Stepanakert can only really be economically viable if they can share water, electricity, they can trade together, and that's a big challenge, obviously. That given the political state of relations between Baku and Yerevan.
I think there is another challenge because they can be viable economically, from the human point of view, etc., when they have connections with two capitals, which is Yerevan and Baku. And the problem there was and there is, they will have connections to either one of the capitals or to another one.
And I think we should also mention another interesting thing, which is Nakhchivan and Republic of Armenia. I mean, those in Soviet times, Nakhchivan, I think economically was much more closely connected with Armenia than with the rest of Azerbaijan because of geography. And then Armenians also used to, I think, as far as I understand it, in Soviet times, used to travel from Yerevan to Megri through Nakhchivan because that was the lowlands route, not go over the mountains. So, and I remember the mayor of Nakhchivan when I went there in 2000, or was it 2001, saying to me, yeah, when I flew to Moscow, I always went from Zvatnots, So, again, logically, you would think that those two places, Nakhchivan and Armenia, should be working together, but politically, that's incredibly difficult, obviously.
Yes, and there was so much happened in this past couple of decades that we cannot expect this happening. I'm afraid I will not see it.
Okay. Yeah. No, you may well be right. But I think if there is progress, it's going to be probably more bottom up than top down. That people poor farmers or traders who see economic advantage in working first quietly with the other side, then maybe a bit more openly.
Now, there are several questions. I mean, unfortunately, our time is limited because there are loads of things I would like to discuss with you. One of the things is the future of Shushi. How can we see it and what may happen there? But it may be also a topic of another lengthy discussion. Now, there were several questions posed for you. There is one quite interesting and tricky one. How do you think why Crimea managed to become a part of Russia through a referendum and Karabakh couldn't be a part of Armenia in the same way?
Well, I think unfortunately geopolitics, my dear Mark, if you want to, unfortunately, in this world, there are more than 100 disputed territories in the world, and I think what history tells us is obviously you can be lucky if you want to secede, but you also help to have powerful friends. Somaliland in Africa is richer, more democratic than Somalia, but it doesn't have any powerful friends who want it to break away. Crimea sort of broke away from Ukraine because Russia wanted to, although of course Russia is still suffering big sanctions, and Crimea, I think, is in a terrible state of isolation as a result. So it's not a very good example. Kosovo had friends in the West and did break away from Serbia. So I think it's it's about many factors, but one of those factors is about choosing your friends and having good political patrons.
Now, when I was preparing this interview, I was always stopping myself from asking you the question starting from how, because there couldn't be any recipes for creating the futures. We can talk only about some scenarios, but we cannot give any recipes. Anyway, there is a question about a recipe: how to build peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Well, I mean, I would love to see this peace. I mean, I must say I'm very fed up with the Karabakh conflict. I'm sure you're in the region, you're much more fed up than me, but personally, I would love to move on from it. It gives me no pleasure to still be talking about it. But I think, you know, one has to start at home. I do believe that one wants a kind of liberal peace is the best option, which means openness, talking about the past, human rights issues being addressed, justice, democracy, all those things which unfortunately are very far away, particularly in Azerbaijan, but also in Armenia. But I think you just have to start at home and build, work on your own society. And, you know, for Armenia, I guess I've also been thinking about Armenia, what starting at home means. And I guess there are, you know, being a small country makes you vulnerable, but it also means that it gives you the power to change things quite quickly, because you're trying to, you know, transform the lives of 3 million people instead of 30 million people. You know, but then you look around the world and you think, look at other small countries, and you think, my goodness, does Armenia want to be Lebanon, which is, you know, 3 decades of internal division, catastrophe, corruption, you know, or maybe, but there are more positive examples. Maybe Armenia should aspire to be Estonia, which you know, is the homeland of Skype and of some of the, you know, one of the best performing economies in Europe, which has joined the Euro, which is a successful member of the European Union. So, you know, hopefully, I wish Armenia the Estonian route rather than the Lebanon route. Estonian obviously has some advantages, geographical advantages, that Armenia doesn't, although it still has, you know, it's still right on the border with Russia, which poses it problems. But I think the Estonian route means, you know, not wasting your precious resources on so many internal fights, not on corruption, on developing the resources of a resource poor country, which are the intellectual resources, the IT sector, which I think is actually, you know, one of Armenia's successes. Looking at those things, so I think you can't change Azerbaijan. You're sitting in Yerevan, but you can change Armenia. So I mean, I guess that's the obvious thing to say.
Now there is another question, which I mean, it's quite a popular question here in Yerevan. Anna Gurjan is asking, why is the world seeing democratic Armenia with the same eyes as autocratic Azerbaijan?
Well, I think that answer comes in 2 parts. I think when it comes to domestic developments, then it's not the case. I think the world is more prepared to invest in democratic Armenia, in institutions, in economy, than it is in Azerbaijan, where very few international organizations are there. And, you know, we know that Azerbaijan is an autocratic country, and if you spend money there, there's a lot of corruption, and that money may disappear. On that respect, I think the world does look more positively on Armenia than Azerbaijan. But when it comes to the conflict, you know, I think the world doesn't see this as that Armenia behaved particularly democratically towards the regions of Azerbaijan around Karabakh. You know, that wasn't an evidence of democracy in the terms of, by holding those regions, it was denying the rights of all the Azerbaijanis who live there. So I think that's something that Armenians find a bit hard to accept. But you know, that's certainly my perspective, is that I could respect the rights of self-determination of the Karabakh Armenians. I have been there many times. I respect them and the dignity of their aspiration there. But I also respect the aspirations of the Azerbaijanis who lost their homes, you know, and were deprived of their rights as a result of the conflict. So that there were, in terms of the world looking at this in terms of rights and freedoms, you know, they were looking at both sides, not just at one side.
Thank you. I think we can end up our conversation at this point, except if there was something that you would like to say and I didn't ask you about that,
Well,
which is a standard question at the end of any interview.
No, it's a good question, Mark, and I'm just glad of the opportunity to have a normal conversation. You know, it's been and to talk about, have a forward-looking conversation. I think a lot of times people, I'm very bored of people, particularly on social media, saying, "Are you pro that you're pro Azeri or pro Armenia or you're?" But the answer is I'm kind of pro everyone. You know, I'm pro my friends. I'm pro Armenia, pro Azerbaijan. I'm just an outsider who has spent lots of time in this region, who's a bit personally invested in it, have friends there, wish the best for everybody. You know, I'm a liberal European, and you know, so I do wish for the best for Armenia. It's a difficult few years, and I'm glad to have these forward-looking conversations and hope to be talking to you again soon, Mark.
And just to add to the thing, when we are talking about rights and you know, human approach, there is another huge human problem in this war, which is the Armenian prisoners of war, which are still held in Azerbaijan. And probably, I haven't heard about anybody, but probably there should be some prisoners of war of Azerbaijan here in Armenia. And I believe we want their liberation from all sides.
Absolutely. Absolutely. People, ordinary people, you know, continue to suffer, and one can only imagine that the pain of those people, the families worrying about people who are still the victims of the conflict. Absolutely.
Thank you, Tom, for being with me, and see you soon and talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.